If you would, please turn your Bibles open to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, that's where we're going to be at this evening. This lesson was inspired by a conversation I had a few weeks back. It was with a gentleman that I met in a coffee shop. I had my Bible open. I was preparing for a Bible class I had later that week. And he came up to me and asked me about what I was reading. And that question led into a 2-hour conversation about his religious background and some of the struggles that he's been having lately. Some of the things that he's been reading in his Bible aren't the same as what he grew up hearing. And so he's in this conflict. He's in this journey with God. I would say that he is wrestling with God. And this conversation, it stayed with me, and it reminded me of conversations I've had before this one. I've had many conversations with people that are struggling and wrestling through questions on their mind that they have about God and about things that they're reading in their Bible. And I thought to myself, if only there was a name for this type of person. You know, like a person that wrestled with God. And then I realized, oh yeah, that's what it means to be an Israelite. And so the question I have for everyone here tonight is, are you an Israelite? Is this a way that you can be described? And the passage that I want to read, and will be your base passage, is here in Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with God. Let's start reading in verse 22. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and the 11 children. And he crossed the ford of the Jabbok, and he took them and sent them across the stream, and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." And he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose up upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. I want to talk to a specific audience tonight. And I want it to be very clear, this lesson is not just for teenagers. This lesson is for those that are wrestling with God right now. Those that are struggling through things that they're reading and things that they're processing in their relationship with them. Those that are having questions. Those that are currently wrestling. And you might be a teenager and you might be a full-grown adult. But this lesson is for those people. I want to talk about what exactly an Israelite is. See, names in the Bible are quite significant. It's not like our culture is in America. I remember there was this assignment in 2nd grade where all the kids had to come in and tell how their name was given. And some kids were like, my name has a special meaning, and another kid was like, I'm named after my great-great-grandfather, and then it came to me. And I think I'm a good example of the modern American. And I said, my parents told me that they couldn't agree on any other name, so they had to choose Dylan because that's the only name they could agree on. And that's why I'm named Dylan, because my parents could agree on that name. And many names are chosen that way. I like the sound of that name, that sounds pretty cool, that it's one of those names that is in right now, and so I'm going to name my child it along with everyone else. But the way the Bible works, the way names are given in the Bible, is they have significance and meaning that tells something deeper about that person and their story. Let me give you a few examples. So first you get Moses. Moses' name means to draw out. You remember when he was a baby, Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the river. And then later, Moses in his life draws the people of Israel out of Egypt. And then we get Elijah, whose name means the Lord is my God. And we see this all throughout the life of Elijah, that he's bold against kings and queens like Ahab and Jezebel, against the prophets of Baal. He is bold to pronounce that the Lord is his God. And you also have Daniel, whose name means the Lord is my judge. And throughout the book of Daniel, in his story, you see that Daniel's not worried about man being his judge. He knows that God alone is his judge. Then you get to Jacob. And Jacob's name means the supplanter or the deceiver. And we see this all throughout the life of Jacob, that he's always tripping people up by the heel. That since the womb, he has been in confliction and contention with his brother, and this culminates in stealing his birthright. That he tricks him into taking this lentil soup and trading the birthright for it, and later on he tricks his father. He deceives him because he has the animal fur on his arm. He says, "I'm Esau," when he's not. The reason that this story here in Genesis 32 is so important is because this is when Jacob becomes Israel. This is that story. You can see it in verses 27 and 28. And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel." The book of Genesis is a book of origins. It's defining and establishing things. And one of those things that's establishing is people and their origins. And so this not only is essential for Jacob and his narrative, but it's essential for the narrative of the Israelite people. Because Jacob goes from the deceiver to the one who wrestles with God. And so this is defining for him, but also the Israelites as a whole. There's a reason that they're not called the Abrahamites. There's a reason they're not called the Isaacites or the Jacobites. There's a reason they're called the Israelites, the people who wrestle with God. The Israelites are the people that God has chosen. We get in Deuteronomy 7 where it says, "For you," describing Israel, "are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." That God has set these people apart, that they're like no other, that he has a special relationship with them. And with this relationship comes things attached. Paul says this, "They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen." That means if I'm born an Israelite, that all of this in the front of my Bible, this Old Testament, that's my family's history. That when God promises something to one of these patriarchs, he's promising it to my family. When I hear things like the Christ is going to come from my people, that's important because I'm an Israelite. And so these aren't just mere stories to me. There's something foundational and essential to who I am as a person. And you might be thinking, well, that's great. That's great for them. I'm really happy for those that are Israelites. But if you are in Christ, you are of Israel. That no longer is it about being of the offspring of Abraham that makes you a part of Israel, but it's about having the faith of Abraham. Offspring does not define what Israel is anymore. And so you have Peter saying this to a group of Gentiles. "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." Doesn't that remind you of Deuteronomy 7? that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you have not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. The reason that we study the Old Testament is because this is our family history. These are promises to our people. This matters to us because we are of Israel. And so when we get to this story about Jacob wrestling with God and becoming Israel, it's not just establishing something important for people long ago that we studied in the back rooms in Bible class, but instead it's establishing something important for us as the people of God. And so we get to this story where Jacob is going and he's interacting with God. You even see this itself, that God approaches Jacob, that God allows this struggle to happen between him and Jacob. If you see in verse 24, it says, a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. But if you skip down to verse 30, it later established, for I have seen God face to face. And later in Hosea, it says that this is God in the form of an angel. And so God is approaching Jacob. He knows that there's going to be something beneficial in this process for Jacob and his character and his growth. But not only that, God holds back through this entire wrestling match. We see just a mere glimpse of his true power in verse 25, where it says, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And the Hebrew word for touch there isn't grab, it isn't pull, it's to merely touch. Like if I was trying to get by you after services and I was trying to do like one of these and like I touched you on accident. That's the idea of the word. A mere touch. I've had both of my shoulders dislocated. One of them was in a wrestling match. And I was putting all my force, all my body pressure one way, and the guy I was wrestling was pulling my arm the complete other way with all his force. And that's how my shoulder dislocated. Shoulders do not dislocate, hips do not dislocate like easily. This is something that is showing just a mere glimpse of his power, that a mere touch could move it out of line. So this shows us something about God and how he interacts with his people. That he's okay with the struggle, that he approaches people in the struggle, that he thinks it's good for them, and he's patient with them as they struggle. You might be in the audience and you're in your wrestling match, where you're trying to figure things out on your own. And you might feel like you're being a bad Christian because of that. That good Christians never question anything, good Christians never have struggles, and that is not the biblical approach. Christians struggle sometimes, and when they struggle, they bring it to God. And God invites that struggle with them. And God is patient through them with that struggle. And so you are not a bad Christian if you have questions. And maybe you aren't that person in the audience that's struggling. I've heard of stories where people were in Bible classes. And they asked questions, and they weren't being contentious, they weren't being disruptive, they were genuinely asking questions. And I know people that have gotten those questions absolutely shut down. I know people that have gotten kicked out of Bible classes for asking certain questions. And that hasn't been here, but that never should be a part of our culture as Christians, as the people of God. That God was patient with you once. That God allowed you to struggle and to make your faith your own. And you have no right to not let someone else do that the same way. We also see that Jacob wrestles God alone. Look at verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. He sends his whole family across the stream. He's going to have some alone time, and maybe he's expecting some rest, some nice time to himself where he can just think through how he's going to approach Esau as that day's coming close. But instead, there's a man that approaches him and basically puts his face in the dirt. I want to be very clear. I even put it on the slide, even though it's not one of my main points. Community is foundational to Christianity. That one of the blessings of God is that we have each other. That we get to uplift each other, to lean on each other, to bring each other closer to Him. But no one can make your faith your own. You have to choose God for yourself. So that means when you get out of high school and you're on your own and you're in your dorm and that alarm goes off and you're tired and you don't want to get up and your parents not making you get up, that will be your decision. And that means when you leave college and maybe there's not that many activities for you anymore and it doesn't really seem like church is serving me or all about me, that means you have to make it your own. And that means that your spouse can't have your faith for you. That means you have to establish that on your own. And that means when the kids leave the house, you have to have your own faith. That it no longer has to be about doing it for them and seeing their good example and bringing them to church because I want that in their life. You have to do it for you. No one else can do it for you. And sometimes we like religion as an environment, but really Christ has never penetrated your own heart or your own life. You have to let God penetrate your heart. It can't just be something that you're sitting in. It can't just be something you're here for a time and it's kind of nice. It has to be your faith. And there's some results of this wrestling match. See, Jacob walks away from this limping. It says in verse 31, limping because of his hip. That he was hurt because of what had happened. That when God touched his hip and it threw it out of joint, that didn't just go back in place and he was all fine. There was some lasting pain from that interaction. But we also see that there was purpose in that suffering. That if you notice in verse 25, when God touches Jacob's hip and it's put out of joint, and then in verse 26, it seems like something changes in between those verses. In that moment, then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." That Jacob is no longer pushing against God, fighting against him, but he is holding on with dear life. He sees him as the most important thing in his life. That if he can't have God, then why have anything else at all? It is important that we change our grip when wrestling with God. That it's no longer about being contentious. It's not about being rebellious. There's a moment that has to change where you trust and lean on Him and see Him as the blessing and the value that He is. And so maybe that's where you're at in your life right now. Everything has been thrown for a loop. And I don't know what exactly that is. Maybe it's a medical update that you weren't expecting. You weren't expecting to hear that from the doctor. Maybe your whole life was thrown into shambles and relationships aren't the same anymore. Whether that be romantic or familial or just friendships. That I can't hang out with the friends that I used to because I'm doing this Christian thing. And maybe that's causing you a lot of pain. But also maybe God is doing that to wake you up. To wake you up to the fact that you've been wrestling the wrong things and searching for the wrong things and trying to find the blessings in the wrong places. And so He allowed suffering in your life so that you would have open eyes. Because it's not only that Jacob walks away from this with a limp, but he also walks away from this obtaining the blessing of God. If you look, we already read in verse 26, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And in verse 29, it says at the end, "And there he blessed him." If you look at the story of Jacob, he's been looking for a blessing his entire life. He's been wrestling with people literally from the womb. He was wrestling Esau in the womb. And he wrestled with Esau out of the womb. And he tried to get prestige, the blessing of riches in his birthright. And he wrestled with his father, and then he wrestled with Laban, because he was searching for the blessing of a wife, of Rachel. Jacob has always been wrestling, but not with God, and especially not for God. And Jacob has always been seeking a blessing, but not looking where the true one is. Our wrestling match should have a result of obtaining that blessing, of seeing God as the valuable blessing in your life He truly is, the thing that you've always been looking for. And maybe you've been looking for it in the wrong places, the same places Jacob has. You've been looking for it in a certain job, in riches, in prestige, that you want to be looked at in a certain way. That you looked for it in a relationship, like he did with Rachel. And you were seeking that, and it didn't work out, and it crushed you. You need to understand that God is the blessing you're looking for. And so hold on with absolute dear life, because if you don't have that, you don't have what you absolutely need. Jacob, in this interaction, is made Israel. He's given a new name. But not only is Jacob given a new name, like we said, names have significance. He's given a new identity. He's given a new character. Instead of being divisive like Jacob's been thus far, this next story is about how him and Esau come together. He has a new understanding of God and how He's worked in his life. I would say that Jacob has become a new creation. Jacob has become Israel. And so in the same way, we need to become the Israel of God. We need to become a new creation. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. And so I ask you the question, ending this sermon the same way that I began it. Are you an Israelite? Do you wrestle with God? Have you made your faith your own? Are you now holding on to Him? Have you obtained that blessing? And maybe you haven't. Maybe you've never held on to God. Maybe you're not at that point, but you want to be. Or maybe you're in the middle of that wrestling match and you're struggling. You're struggling and you're hurting and you're feeling that limp in your side where your hip's dislocated. Whatever way that we can help you and pray for you, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.